first I want to acknowledge, of course, my host. Thanks to Justin and Betsy and Meredith and everyone for having me here. Also want to acknowledge that my partner, who is not here today, couldn't make it because of family obligations. Lev Kushner, who runs the department of here, is a former official in Bloomberg era New York economic development, and really sort of my thought partner in developing the ideas I want to talk about today, because I'm first and foremost an urbanist, and first and foremost my concern is basically helping cities and local municipal stakeholders think through the implications of these technological and cultural changes that are, of course, sweeping through the United States, of which remote work and hybrid work is just one of them. But what I want to talk today is about basically how do you take a program like Tulsa Remote and begin to think about and operationalize that, not just in the hands of a wonderful philanthropy like the George Kaiser Family Foundation, but also the sense of actually bringing in government money. How do we operationalize it as a matter of policy that cities should be embracing remote workers and bringing them in by the score, by the hundreds, by the thousands? So in this case, the sort of overall function here is, obviously we can argue about the exponential. I know we have the screens here. Technology and culture evolve much more rapidly than other layers of cities, namely government. And this goes back, for example, if you look at the famous shearing layers diagrams of Frank Duffy about how buildings evolve, where of course the foundations, the earth is the slowest thing to change, then the structures, and then of course inside of that you have various systems down to the furniture moves much more rapidly, which is lessons for co-working. Most of the time when it comes to the fact that government evolves more slowly than technology and culture, I personally think that is a good thing. Government, of course, is there to work for all of us and to protect people as well as enable us further. But I think when it comes to thinking about economic development, and particularly in the age of remote work and what we have available to us, government is a bit stuck in the past. So what I want to talk today about is about how do we think about perhaps reinventing some of those city government functions and state level. I won't touch the feds, but let's look at both city and state level to rethink about how you can basically enable these people. Because, when you think about government workers today, this is exactly what you imagine if you're fans of Everything Everywhere All at Once. Jamie Lee Curtis playing the ultimately, ultimately helpful and ultimately understanding government employee. But here, I love those awards in the background. If you've seen the film, you know how those come into play. But I want to talk today about this idea of the nomadic city, a city that is designed to encourage new arrivals, rather than thinking about the ongoing problems of brain drain. I think it's endlessly fascinating when I talk to cities and regions in my work that it's the constant concern about how do we keep young people to stay. Well, it's this notion of how do we bring people in? How do we turn tourists? How do we turn those visitors into permanent residents? And how do we build the supporting scaffolding and structure to make this possible at scale? So let's start with traditional economic development. I don't know how much the people in the room know about this process because it is by design very much a black box. 10 years ago, for example, I was on the phone with Larry Morrissey, who was then the mayor of Rockford, Illinois. I'm from Illinois, and if you know Rockford, it's about a city about 150,000 people, 400,000 metro, half the size of Tulsa. But Larry Morrissey was fed up with economic development. And it's a dark art. You can read magazines like Site Selection, for example. In traditional corporate economic development, cities and states produce these kinds of documents and go to companies and basically offer shovel-ready brownfield sites, tax abatements, offers to connect to highways, and they hope to get, a few dozen jobs. Like literally, for example, Axios in their AI newsletter today mentioned that Columbus, Ohio, the state capital, one of the fastest growing cities in the Midwest, recently gave Microsoft a 15-year tax abatement on a $420 million data center that will create a grand total of 30 jobs. Like, this is what Morrissey was upset about. And he swore to me on this call that he was no longer going to go sit in some hotel ballroom and basically beg companies to build warehouses in his town or data centers today. And instead, he was going to Chicago and he was going to try to recruit a 6-person artisanal shoe company, because this was 2014 and artisanal shoemaking was still really big then. But it was this idea. And of course, economic development also traditionally is, yes, states on states, cities on cities, a race to the bottom in terms of who can give away the store the most, and the sort of interregional conflict. And the ultimate example of this, the pinnacle and the nadir, was, of course, Amazon HQ2 back in 2018. Again, I'm from Kankakee, Illinois, which is about an hour south of Chicago, and Kankakee's proposal was to literally give them Amazon City. They were going to give them unincorporated land, hand them an airport, the local airport, and basically give Amazon carte blanche. And that still, of course, wasn't enough. Amazon, of course, did this to over 280 municipalities around the United States, and in the end, picked the 2 places it wanted to go. New York City, where residents like myself were appalled that we were going to give them $3 billion in tax breaks to move to a place they were already going to move to, and Arlington, Virginia, where they did break ground on this, and then pause the project because despite Andy Jassy's efforts to get everyone back into the office, they can't. And so that entire project is stalled. So you can sort of see where the real dead end of this development actually lands there. And so we see, obviously, we're all here today because there's this new emerging model. Rather than throwing tax breaks after companies to beg them to relocate jobs, effectively by force, can we actually become attractors? How do we attract individual talent and win the battle for hearts and minds? Now, Tulsa Remote, of course, is the oldest, the most successful at this. There are others, and many popped up to various degrees during the pandemic. Probably the next closest to this is Northwest Arkansas, home of Bentonville and Fayetteville, backed by the Waltons in a similar way that the Kaiser family is here. And there, of course, they famously offer, if you know the whole background of this, they offer not just $10,000 to relocate, but $10,000 on a mountain bike. Because they're very promising. They're very proud of their mountain biking there. But a smaller one was the Savannah Economic Development Authority during the pandemic, and they're very emblematic of many small ones I spoke to, where in 2020, of course, with travel being grounded, they took their leftover travel budgets and used to pop up a similar program, which attracted, I think, 50 people that year, including, I think they were proud, they got some Facebook product managers, for example, there. But that was also, of course, interesting because Savannah, like Tulsa and many other smaller cities around the United States, has a unique heritage, culture, history, building typology, and they were able to sell that to individuals. Now, this is where I need to update, Lev and I need to update the slide, because of course it's 3K now, because Tulsa Remote's been so successful. But here, the question of scaling these efforts, right? 3,000 people in a metro of 1 million is still just 3% or 0.3% of the total overall. There's also the question here about the ultimate overall economic impact. I think Raj underscored how well this is working out in terms of entrepreneurialism there. But moving from just beyond circulating discretionary spending dollars from people who are earning elsewhere, remote workers, and spending it here, how do you basically create and deepen that pipeline here to get people to actually start businesses and to spend and to build lives here? And this is where governments can step in. Now, opposite of economic development is, of course, tourism. This idea of a highly developed system by most cities to basically attract people, but for very short periods of time. If economic development is about luring corporations and permanent workers, tourism is, of course, about luring you for a weekend, and it's completely optimized for a completely different funnel of this. And and it's been used to great effort and great extent here by New York City, for example, which used tourism as its own way to reposition itself post 9/11 to diversify its economy away from the finance downtown. And for places like New York and the Great Magnets, tourism has been huge. This is Jed Walentis, son of a real estate developer who was the son of another real estate developer who developed Dumbo, for example, and big swaths of Williamsburg. And to an extent, he's right. I have to give him credit for this. But tourism taken to the end also becomes ultimately in a form parasitic on cities, right? You focus too much on lower paying, lower wage jobs that are focused on catering to those, hospitality, F&B, good jobs for people, but not the sustained economic growth you want. So you don't want to over-focus on tourism. But again, this is the trend that was developing and then really intensified during the pandemic was the sort of blurring of the two, of workations from anywhere. And this image that Lev and I put in because you might be familiar. I think some of the ire of return to office, particularly of tech companies, is you might remember a viral video from a few years ago of two product managers in swimsuits typing away at the pool, trying to explain what they did at their tech companies. It's widely believed that this was enough to start the layoffs and start dragging people back. But I think about this. Here's a question on digital nomads here, this new model. How many of you consider yourselves digital nomads? Can I get a show of hands? Okay, there's some, and this is a highly optimized room. It's really interesting to me because MBO Partners, which publishes an annual survey on this, estimates there are 18 million Americans who would identify themselves as digital nomads. I think that's probably overstated here, but I do think it speaks to this notion of this, this massive intensification that happened during the pandemic and a way of thinking about flexibility of work. Because this is where economic development and tourism start to blend together, right? We saw, of course, the blended work and leisure trips. Bleisure, a word that I will never leave my lips again. We saw companies like Airbnb. Brian Chesky during the pandemic went all in on thinking about repositioning Airbnb as an extended stay away from being vacation rentals in cities towards this. Of course, revenge travel came back shortly thereafter in 2022, and Airbnb pivoted different directions. But we saw, again, the sort of broader signals here from the tourism and travel industry, such as, for example, the CEO of United Airlines saying that they've seen a permanent structural change in how and when vacation season happens. Summer is still big, but there's been a blurring, a smoothing of demand across the calendar because of the rise of this flexibility in work. Fall is now very much a vacation season. My editor at Fast Company, who I owe reports to, is currently co-working right now from Marseille. This is in addition to his winter co-working from Palm Desert. So, you can sort of see how this blurs together. And this is this new landscape that's emerging. Rather than, of course, rather than attracting corporations, can you attract talent? And rather than trying to basically fight trench warfare for permanent relocations, can you basically try to lure these digital nomads across the event horizon of staying in your city? For cities and for governments, this is going to be a radical shift in how they approach this new form of economic development. Right now, it's very B2B, and what they need to move to get into tourism is very B2C, a completely different kind of metabolism, operational tempo, and dealing with people. B2B, very high upside, handful of deals, a relatively small staff. You need to basically know how to get into the right room with the right people and the right messaging. While, of course, B2C in tourism is very, very high touch. Huge staff, very, high energy out there with lots of differentiated branding, lots of A/B testing, lots of messaging into various outlets, ranging from travel magazines to, of course, the entire online ecosystem when it comes to reaching people. And of course, massaging the brand of a place to its different audiences. So, right now, this is kind of seems implausible, right? You can't take the current city staffs as they exist in economic development and try to make the pitch to all of you that you should move to Tulsa or anywhere else. How do you basically create this sort of structure? What are the pieces that it would take to put together this new kind of entity that would make it easy for people to move to a place, that would create the kind of bespoke hand-holding to bring them there? And Tulsa Remote, obviously, is sort of the beginnings of this. But yeah, how do you basically take those people who might be visitors and bring them into a more permanent place? So obviously, I spent 21, 22 thinking about how do we put these things together? What is the ecosystem of places? Raj mentioned engineering serendipity. I spent more than a decade thinking about the rise of co-working and the rise of flexible workspaces and what it means for cities and how we could think about more flexible economic development. So in addition to, of course, this space and the great collaboration hub that's being under development here, how can cities take this crisis of empty office space and crisis of underutilized assets and think of a way to basically turn them into attractors for people? So, for example, it was about a decade ago that I was in Australia to visit Renew Newcastle. Newcastle is, let's say, the Cleveland of Australia, if Cleveland had like 40 miles of perfect beaches on the Pacific and perfect weather. But Newcastle was a former steel town that had an earthquake and fell apart. And it was there that I met Marcus Westbury, who was an arts festival organizer, who figured out that no one was willing to lease him the space to open a bar because of all the entanglements around valuations and foreclosures and things like this. So he hacked together Renew Newcastle as a program to convince the owners of those properties to let them use their vacant spaces, not on a lease basis, not for ownership, but just to simply offer permits. Let the tenants pay for utilities and security and electricity, and they would give it away. They would basically let them have it on a 30-day rolling permit for this. Renew Newcastle, 15 years later, has leased half of the spaces of the program, over 300 at market rates. They got an 11x return on their initial $100,000 Australian grant from the provincial government. And it's become a model across Australia and somewhat globally. There's offshoots in Copenhagen and Toronto as a way to basically pop up this space on a rolling basis. And so these are the kinds of things that cities need to think about. How do you create these kinds of programs that can match people with spaces that are appropriate to their needs and that basically can cause them to work out loud, if you know this whole notion of it, of how do we work together in public? How do we be together in public to engineer that kind of serendipity? Then also, of course, you need the ability to basically welcome people in. How do you create the kind of concierge services that will help people come in here and, and effectively, for those digital nomads or for those who would move with children, with families, how do you create those kind of services to bring them in? And I think that's going to be a real demand for cities, is to create the kind of partnerships with the business communities, which we've already seen. Lots of sort of chambers of commerces and other sort of business entities have been key in developing these kinds of programs. But how do you work together with the local business community to do this? And this will be very interesting in light of the NAR lawsuits to be followed in sort of residential real estate, where it's not just basically show somebody a house and you get a 6% commission. There's probably a ripe community of brokers now in every American mid-sized city that would be welcome to bring people in. And this, of course, is part of the larger backdrop, which I'm sure you're familiar with here, as we've seen during the pandemic, that Americans moved in pursuit of housing affordability en masse out of coastal metros and large cities to basically get more affordable, larger housing in America's smaller cities. I believe it's in Raj's piece, I was reading in the New York Times here, that that basically the average program participant in Tulsa Remote saved $25,000 on housing costs. My response to that is only $25,000, given that we've seen housing costs go up 40% in the United States since the pandemic. So how do we design those programs to help bring people in? And then there's the engineering serendipity part. That's where cities, I think, need to be creative in how they sort of structure these cohorts, learning from the lessons of Tulsa Remote. So to Raj's point, and this, of course, goes back to employers as well. The book I did not write, one of the central tenets of it was thinking about how do we become more intentional about how we bring people together and connect all the latent possible connections in here. I assure you, the least valuable thing you can be doing with your time right now is listening to me. You should all be connecting amongst yourselves. And the question is, how do we do that more effectively than the indirect methods of bringing you all here in the room and having this great programming today? My friend Brandon Klein, who was a former chief collaboration officer at United Health Group in Minneapolis, who was in charge of basically actualizing and activating their very large real estate footprint in the Twin Cities, later became a consultant, opened a co-working space in Minneapolis, and wrote his own software called Collaboration.ai. And in 2016, I was in Tokyo with him for the capstone exercise of the World Economic Forum's Young Global Leaders, those who will inherit the world. I believe both Chelsea Clinton and Ivanka Trump were there. This is a week before the election then. Brian Chesky again was there and others. And basically Brendan showed me how they had used a combination of social network analysis of the cohort members, what they were passionate about, what common experiences they had in common, used machine learning to figure out how to suggest them into pairs and teams, and then used high-touch facilitation to bring them together at the right moment at the right time. In that case, they were trying to create new initiatives for the WEF. I believe the metric is that over the 3 years of this program, a series of meetings, this cohort together, they created 50 new nonprofit initiatives, which was 10 times the amount they'd created over the previous 6 years. So we have these kinds of tools here about understanding, analyzing communications and understanding interests to bring people together. And then you can do that through the forms of dinners and community activations that Tulsa Remote and others have done so well. So who needs to do this? How do we think about this? Well, you're going to need all sorts of really interesting sets of skill sets. You're going to need someone who is, of course, hyper responsive to this, responsive in a way that governments often aren't, who can, like the ding of a bellhop, be there on point there to basically help with various needs. Someone, of course, very trusted entities here who can deliver on these promises, who can basically make people feel safe and feel embedded in their communities. And let me tell you, the social costs are, of course, high. I'm not sure about your experiences, but I am also a remote worker in a way. I've been effectively freelance for over a decade and emigrated to Montreal, Quebec in 2019, shortly before the pandemic, and then navigated solo the Quebec and Canadian tax codes, among other things. It has been quite the experience. So how do you streamline these programs to guide people step by step through this? And I know others here, Nomad List, and there's some other interesting sites that have tried to do this, particularly with foreign immigration. When you get into visas and you get into tax policies, even state by state, this can be quite difficult. And many times companies are very unwilling or digging in their heels when they think about the compliance issues of nomadic workers. I was giving a talk, I forget the name of it, Rheology, it's changed its name, the corporate holding company, but I was seated at dinner next to basically one of the chief talent officers at PepsiCo, who told me when I was discussing like Barbados, for example, which launched the original functional digital nomad visa policy during the pandemic, that that PepsiCo was fighting to keep people off planes to Barbados because if you landed there and started doing work from there, you would suddenly expose the entire company to the tax regime of Barbados, which was what they did not want to see happen. So you've got to think about who can help basically create more structured processes to help these new arrivals in town. And then, of course, you need that front-facing person to basically guide them through. And this is, I think, where co-working is very interesting because we saw the rise of basically chief community officers. We saw the rise of this sort of concierge there, helping people integrate into the work environment. How do you do that at city scale? And how do you do it in a way that creates those sort of good feelings there? So there's other great examples here. I've praised Tulsa Remote. One of them's here. I think Evan's behind a pillar, but Evan Hawk of Make My Move did this basically for the state of Indiana, not just for a single city or organization, but created a clearinghouse and a website to basically start structuring together these kinds of partnerships. My favorite one, the site at the time, was Greater Lafayette, Indiana, which is home to Purdue University. There, they basically put together a whole package of incentives that were not only just cash and not only other sort of welcome packages, but Purdue offered to basically make its facilities open to the arrivals as part of the program. So it was a great example of thinking about, and this is what cities have to think about, is who are the assets in your community that can offer these kinds of amenities to people? It could go beyond just what's directly in your control. How do you work together with that? And then also, more recently, the Indiana Economic Development Corporation effectively was able to change its charter where it could now give grants to individuals as well as companies, a sea change in how we do economic development. So the laws are beginning to change there. Evan was just telling me that, 2 updates on this particular one. This particular offer, Greater Lafayette, has been suspended because a rise in housing costs. And we should talk about this. It's not perhaps been a big a deal in Tulsa yet, but obviously there is, of course, both the actual reality of new arrivals with home prices in places that refuse to build, but also the optics. And then second here is, this ongoing thing of, the state is basically trying to lobby the Economic Development Corporation is trying to lobby to get more funding to this to really start to scale up the program because we're still quite small. Just other examples, Greater Topeka Partnership is one where that's an example where business-led institutions were attracting people to the state capitol. But in this case, they've had difficulty in terms of having a critical mass of co-working and other amenities to make that available to people. And then just a lack of coordinating the stakeholders. So, what are mapping out those kinds of partnerships in the ecosystem is something cities need to do. Now, what does this look like in reality? Well, you're going to have to figure out for cities that are interested in this model, and I think they should be, because I think this is a powerful new method for particularly the smaller, mid-sized metros to which many Americans have moved over the last 4 years. How do you take those strengths of economic development in terms of, expediting permits and smoothing out business processes and that dark matter to make it possible to do business there and wrangling the various city agencies, but with that consumer-facing side of marketing and branding and customer service. And Lev and I call this the Department of Hospitality. If you take this and merge this together, you are hospitable to businesses, you are hospitable to new arrivals, and ideally you are hospitable to the people you serve in your city as well. Because the biggest criticism of this entire approach, and frankly, to any of the programs like this, is if you're doing all this much for new arrivals in cities, why aren't you doing this for us as well? There's a really powerful equity argument to be made for and against this, that perhaps this can become the start of a larger reorganization of cities and how they serve their residents and their constituents. So how do you get there? There is unfortunately no playbook for this. Perhaps Lev and I should write it. We've got some thinking about how to do it. He spent some time in San Francisco. I think it's very funny that San Francisco is now a place where we have to feel sorry for it and help it re-attract people who moved away from it. But how do you think about these kinds of combination of assets? Whether that is, for example, whether it's Muni, basically offering the kind of assets when it comes to getting people on public transportation, which of course has seen a fall during the pandemic. I've seen individual real estate developers, for example, like cul-de-sac in Phoenix, where in lieu of having parking there, you get a basket of benefits like a transit pass, like Uber rides, like scooter access. How do you rethink your mobility offerings for these new arrivals? How do you think through about basically, for example, from planning perspective, enabling the kind of flexible workspaces like our new Newcastle? And then, of course, also the safety issue as well. How do you basically approach this and make it clear to people that public safety is enforced? Because that's, of course, a huge fear for cities. I could go on and on, but I'm running low on time, and I want to address actually some of the digital twin and other engineering serendipity issues that Raj raised, which I think are fascinating. But 4 quick takeaways from this. Number one, nomadism is growing. This much is clear. However we define digital nomads, a narrow definition or a broad one, it is very clear that people are increasingly untethered to a degree they weren't before, whether that means they have more time to do workations, whether that means they are now circling the globe moving every month or so, like your iconic ones going to Bali and Chiang Mai. But it's clear that there is a significant and growing portion of the American population that is up for grabs from a talent attraction and from a residential standpoint. And so it's necessary for cities to think about this. 2, in the long run, tourism is going to devour economic development. And I think this is a very key point here, that basically, that just as we've seen the reinvention of so many business processes. I mean, let's go, for example, that Mark Benioff of Salesforce and the reinvention of CRM software was originally fueled by his insight that, why can't everything be as easy or as convenient and frictionless as an Amazon or other organizations that invest a ton into their UX design? Tourism is closer to this in economic development, but it's going to have to be those functions of streamlining those processes, making it more attractive to people that will give it the upper hand over economic development. This one is key, and I think we all understand this being here today. The idea of the city itself as a product. That rather than, and this goes back to Richard Florida, who I believe was here last week here on a recent report he's just done on this idea that the city itself is, the attractor. It is a place where you want to move to because of its combination of assets. And that dovetails with this one too. How do you market the city itself, its history, its culture, its heritage as that particular product and attract the kind of people who want to be attracted to that place? I think traditionally economic development is undifferentiated, just basically wants to bring in corporations and treats almost every place as fungible. What if we do the opposite and we only want the people to move to Tulsa who are really drawn to what Tulsa represents? And then this dovetails with quality of life as a sales tool. How do you basically then break down those sets of features here to basically make it reach that potential audience? And, it's essential as buying some online ads, I suppose, but word of mouth and actually cultivating those kinds of communities here to basically make it a ripe destination for people. And to end on that note here, it's, what's good for the guest is good for the host, especially when the guest might never leave. And this, of course, is underscored, I think, in Raj's research. I think the subtitle of the New York Times piece today is that basically everybody won in the experiment we have with Tulsa Remote so far. So again, this gets back to, though, the equity piece. Because in the long run, as cities develop this and as Tulsa Remote develops this, there will be problems of success that will be, of course, the problems of potential housing scarcity and rising prices. And cities that are serious about attracting people will eventually have to pivot to thinking about how do we basically create more room for them and how do we embed them in these communities. I'll just note there that I think the tide is beginning to turn on this, because we've seen in Ohio, the state development agency there is thinking about rebranding. We've seen in the state of Michigan the creation of a chief growth officer whose job it is, whose remit is to bring people back into the state or attract them in. So we're starting to think about this, rather than a hidebound bureaucracy, we're starting to see the government is learning from things like Tulsa Remote and these other organizations to create a faster, more evolving shearing lay for government. All right, with that, that's the end of my prepared remarks. Thank you so much. I'm happy to take any questions here. I got a few minutes left. I do want to add before we get to questions here, and I know Raj will be back up here in a second. It's interesting, one of the projects I'm working on now is thinking about the implications of digital twins and agentic systems, which is how it evolves, where AIs, where instead of one chatbot, you have a dozen or 100 or 1,000 that are able to do work together. And I think about this because there have been efforts already underway to think about, we saw employers during the pandemic and now try to do massive surveillance of remote employees. First, to ensure compliance, but there's a rising idea that this will be used to create digital twins, forced digital twins of people. And also in passing that I think one of the projects I'm working on now with the Future of Life Institute is to think about the policy implications of this and what protections people should have about their own form of digital likeness. Because I've met a digital twin. The engineering firm Thornton Tomasetti, their steel expert, Mike DeLashman, was retiring. He was 65. They took 30 years of his emails and presentations and built a digital twin of him called Mike 2.0. He back tested it. He rated it was about 94% accurate to what he would have said. And they started using the tool. And then Mike unfortunately died at the age of 65. When I emailed their CTO, their chief technical officer, to ask, who owns Mike 2.0 and what are the legalities of this? He wrote back, LOL, it's the Wild West. So I think about this, if our employers are going to build digital twins of us, what protections do we have? What rights do we have to it? And it's something we need to think about here, that this has not become another power play on behalf of employers to wrest back that freedom and independence that we have. All right, so now I'll go to questions. Thank you. Sorry.
Perfect. I have a question about cities as, trying not to become commodities. So Gen Z, more than any of the 4 previous generations, does not want to drive, wants to live in a place where they want to exist and they love the place itself and they don't want to get in a car and go somewhere else. But as you pointed out, Tulsa Remote is 0.3% of the greater Tulsa area, where the political will to support alternatives to driving is very low. So I'm wondering if you have comments on how we can change that.
The short answer is, the short answer is basically creating a political constituency. It will be interesting to see if remote workers become a sort of self-organized force in terms of advocating for those kinds of political changes and amenities. Because you're right. This is one of the biggest inhibitors to the chief growth officer in Michigan is the fact that no one wants to live in the hellscape sprawl of Southeast Michigan. I say this is someone from the hellscape sprawl of Southern Chicagoland. And so, that's a major inhibitor of that. And in Toronto, for example, the province of Ontario, because I live in Canada now, they just cracked down where they're going to prevent Toronto from actually building bike lanes without provincial approval. So you're seeing this constituent pushback of this. And the only way I can think of to do is to basically build some sort of political power. Perhaps it looks like, some sort of local lobbying, but obviously embedding yourselves into the community itself, learning your local representatives of this and advocating for that and making clear those kinds of needs and arguing the larger case that it's, of course, good for business. I still believe it's crazy, and I'll end here, but I still think it's crazy because I also spent time in mobility research, that there is a widespread belief that replacing parking with outdoor activations or bike lanes decreases traffic to local businesses. All the surveys are clear that bike lanes increase foot traffic of this. So I don't know. I don't know if it's a political turnover problem. I don't know if it's something where you can get people into office who are more amenable to this. But it's something to think about here, that we can't just be, and this is, I think the most interesting message of this when it comes to being in a community, we can't just be free agents. We can't just be people who are based in a place. We have to live here and be true residents and constituents of this to create the kind of places we want to love. So thank you for that. I think that's it. We have to be involved and we have to activize.
Hi, I'm Dr. Andrea Williams, and one of my questions really pertains, I thought you were going to dovetail into this, but I think as Gen Z and Gen Alpha are thinking about authenticity more than anything, how do cities, in your experience, think about the challenge to not commodify community, right, in this way that makes people want to come to it, but how do you attract that type of talent, or how, moreover, do you retain BIPOC talent in a way that is groundbreaking? Have you seen studies of cities? I know you mentioned Topeka and some other cities, but have you seen cities that are doing this in this way that is very authentic, that repositions that question of like, well, how do we get them to come? But it's like, well, how do we get them to stay? In a way that, we think about that concierge model that you talked about, of how do we put together, packages or incentivizing or some way that makes people feel really grounded in what community actually is and not what we purport it to be.
Yeah, that is a great question, and that goes hand in hand with this larger question of the sort of broader equity of it. I mean, I think it's two pieces. One, it's just the care in which you put into who is involved in the room, and the people who are involved in designing the program and making sure they have those BIPOC voices. Because otherwise you run the risk of, and I guess since you bring up Gen Z, of like millennial aesthetic, of airspace. I think Kyle Chayka once called it, of like completely homogenized cool. That you run the risk of, which goes hand in hand with gentrification, which is like the risk of all this. Renew Newcastle in Australia as part of it. I mean, their biggest supporter of that program were large corporate developers who saw it as a pilot fish to basically create that homogeny once they moved in. So I think about that in that regard. It's like, number one, designing those kinds of concierge programs in terms of what constituencies you want to reach, and make sure it's not just wealthy white people effectively. And then two, I think the key of it is going to be basically ensuring that there are some checks or balances in place to make sure that the market, when it comes to gentrification development, when you succeed, assuming you're a struggling place, does not run out of control. I worked on this conceptually a dozen years ago with the Architect Jeannie Gang. We were thinking about this as a model of revitalization for Cicero, Illinois, which started as Al Capone and very Polish and German, and is now today 88% Hispanic and 48% foreign-born. It's a completely different neighborhood. And so we were interested about, like, how do you protect the residents in place while encouraging development? And the mechanism that we liked was community land trust, which is very talked about now, which is the notion, and it's actually philanthropic organizations like Kaiser, I'm not sure they are, but like in Chicago it's MacArthur, where you actually protect land, you put it into trust, you create activations on top of it, and then basically that revitalizes the areas around it while protecting that core. And the example that I've actually seen was in Montreal. My home, I finally saw somebody who built it. Bâtiment 7 is a former rail warehouse that was going to be sold to a casino developer for $1, one of those classic development tactics. And the residents actually occupied it. They staged interventions and they renovated it themselves. The residents picked up bricks and sorted them out. And today it's home to a handful of collectives, all of local residents in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood. There's bicycle repair and metal repair and woodworking and studios and the entire scaffolding of community scale co-working of this for their actual residential needs. I think it's a powerful model. That needs to be the core, I think, of any kind of program like this for those arrivals, so you can expand it beyond those of us who are privileged enough to be in the laptop class, as I like to think of it, where we get on broadband and we can float across the landscape. There's a whole other area of this. And I think there's some interesting programs. A final note of this, Southwest Detroit has done this too. 10 years ago, I was there visiting it, and there were a number of programs there about like Mexican immigrants into Southwest Detroit who were making it one of the only population growing regions of the city at that time. And they were developing similar programs to basically create, lumber yards and sort of the businesses provided that would help these kinds of arrivals and laborers create their own businesses. So there needs to be, I guess, a way of actual matching of facilities to the actual needs of both permanent residents who are already there and the new arrivals who may not just be us, walking around with our laptops.
Hi, I'm Danielle Farage. I'm actually speaking tomorrow about Gen Z. So if you have any questions, please come up to me. Come find me. So I did a program last year in Croatia, in Central Istria. And it was really interesting. It was like this digital nomad house for about a month. I would love your take on European cities and countries and how they might be thinking about this a little bit differently, what the success is, and really anything you generally want to share about Europe versus the US.
All right. Well, a quick shout for that one. Darcy was here, I think, right in front of you. I would say we need to chat with her because she's moving to Madeira to be part of Startup Madeira, which is one of those programs. I think the European ones are interesting, and I looked extensively into it. Again, they're all interesting. And so you mentioned Croatia. I forget his name. I talked to the creator of the digital nomad visa for Croatia. And again, he reported that the government its response was basically suspicion and hostility to this idea. And so we've seen this. Gonzalo Hall, is it? Yeah, it's Hall. Gonzalo Hall, the equivalent, the maestro of this, doing this for Portugal. I think he's gotten the most traction where, he, again, Madeira, the islands off of Portugal, went in and basically my favorite anecdote that he told me there was they had to go to the local restaurants and tell them like, look, we have a bunch of like startup people coming. You need to offer vegetarian options because Madeira was all like beef, despite being island chain. European cuisine's interesting. But the less fancy answer is like, yes, there are all these sort of interesting archipelagos of effort. My favorite that I was going to apply to is Venywhere. Venice was going to do this. Of course, again, a dying historic city. And that's, I think, what Raj mentioned. That's where Cisco is now embedding Teams as part of this. Is just, again, but using it as a bit of a tourist backdrop. No one has done this systematically. Nomad List, the site, actually was trying to put together a checklist of this. I got on a call and paid 500 euros to discuss an immigration attorney in Portugal. But as Darcy knows far better than I, like, it's crazy how ad hoc and put together this is. She was telling me, and you guys should chat, that she was getting like Word docs off Facebook groups. Like, this makes me want to pull my hair out. And that's what comes back to like my impetus for this is there's a real effort by private interests or working public in hand to streamline this and make it possible for this. Because international is just a whole other kettle of fish. Sovereignty came back in force during the pandemic there, and borders are hardening, of course, because immigration globally is being villainized to various extents, either for stealing jobs or stealing housing. I was just fortunate enough to get permanent residency in Canada, and they are closing that door. So yeah, I think our best bet is actually Americans in communities in the United States. But yeah, I'm afraid that perhaps the time to be a digital nomad in Europe might be ending a bit. The golden visa programs for those of us who have $250,000 euros lying around are also being shut down because they were using them to bring in arms dealers, unfortunately. So I'm hopeful that we might find one, and yeah, maybe Gonzalo will figure out and get the government of Portugal involved. But it's very slowly dawning on those policymakers as well that this is something that could be good for them. But like I said, it's a moment instead where the wheel is turning back against immigration, not in favor of it.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. Round of applause for Greg Lindsay.